Okay, good afternoon. Sorry for the slight delay or bad delay. Only 10 minutes. Okay, we'll try to catch up. Welcome, everybody. I am very pleased to introduce Marina Calloni and Michele Nicoletti, who will with me will give the opening remarks before Simona Lanzoni's first plenary lecture. So let us get started right away. Marina Calloni, who is the coordinator of the network UNIRE. Shall I stop you?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the effort, Giovanna and her staff and Professor Nicoletti, just for organizing this conference and just to launch our network of academic network, which is at the moment based in Italy, but our ambition is just to expand this network also to European country and not only. And we are already working, as Professor Nicoletti will tell you, with the Council of Europe in Strasbourg. So just a few words, because we'll start with what is the topic of this conference. It is that the struggle against gender-based violence is not only a legal struggle or political struggle, but it's mainly also a cultural, educational and scientific battle. We have also to deal with daily while teaching and researching. So a few words presenting our network and aims. These are, the main points, the role of the university, our aim, the background, the reason why we constituted this network, our task, objectives, and then our ambitions. That is just to work for an integrated and holistic approach in European universities. We started from the convention, Istanbul Convention, ratified in Italy in 1913, because we see that the Istanbul Convention has at least 5 articles dealing with university tasks. That is Article 11 about data collection and research, Article 12 about prevention, Article 13 about sensitization, 14 education, and 15 training. We tried just to apply the Istanbul Convention university, referring mainly to these 5 points. The project, the academic network, is called UNIRE, which in Italy means UNIRE unit, but is an acronym about Università in Rete, contro la violenza. That means university, networking university against violence. And the aim of our network is just because we think that the university system is called to play a pivotal education, scientific, cultural and social role for the elimination of harmful prejudice and also gender-based violence. So we decided to constitute a synergic network of university which can contribute to promote a significant cultural initiative, and we offer also the change of violent mentalities. So the network is aimed at promoting and developing teaching, training, research, third mission activities, advocacy, awareness campaigns in an international perspective, but not just the university in itself, but university can work in this sense only with interaction with anti-violence centers, civil society, research center, hospitals, police, and whatever. So in this sense, we are talking about an holistic approach to the struggle against domestic violence. The background is thanks to Professor Nicoletti, who is a former MP, member of the Italian Parliament, but he also had a very important job because he was President of the Parliamentary Assembly at the Council of Europe. And we started to think about this project when we also, with Professor Covin and other colleagues, we were member of a scientific committee for a award, just a prize for the best thesis on thesis master and PhD thesis on domestic on the Istanbul application of Istanbul Convention. We work at that time already with a conference of the rectors of Italian university, which are really very strongly the president, also my rector, who are very much strongly supporting our initiatives. The task we got, we were financed by the Italian presidency of the Council of Ministers in the past legislature, I would say. It's based, the coordination is based at the University of Milano-Bicocca, and at the moment we have 10 universities composing the network: Milan, Milano, Padova, Foggia, Calabria, Cattolica, Trento, Trieste, Rome. All the 3 parts of North, Central and South Italy. But our aim, our ambition is just to extend this network to all 96 Italian universities, private, public, and also online universities. The objectives are mainly 5: strengthening existing activities, developing new educational initiatives, supporting scientific analysis, increasing the collaboration with different stakeholders at the local level, that is institution, experts, as said, anti-violence centers, professional associations, and 5th, developing international collaboration, which is the next step, but here we have also distinguished guests, international guests, and also Professor Klein and other colleagues who can also give us also support, but mainly also collaboration. The objectives are mainly, as said, 5: information, formation. Formation, we think it has to do with education at all levels. Formation is also training. That is, perfezionamento, masters, and so on. That is lifelong learning. Research, third mission, international collaboration. The units, as said, these are the names of the core of present project, but as said, we are keen to enlarge the network, and we were talking before just thinking when to organize the meeting, inviting all Italian university, and we were thinking when the Grevio, and we have also Simona Lanzoni, but will be not part of the Grevio because she's Italian, so she will be not part of this investigation, but perhaps we'll organize in March, and we'll send you the invitation in advance. These are all Padua, Trento, Trieste, famous in Italy is Trento, Trieste, and then also the hospital Cagranda in Milan. Last slides is the fact that we are strongly also supporting an approach which should be integrated and holistic to European university. It is also the new role and the challenges of European university nowadays. And we also this project is also based on the experiences done over the years, also as in the case of Professor Covi, of researchers, teaching experiences, international networks. So we are trying to give value to what we learned and we have done in the past, just not to leave this inheritance, this legacy without any follow-up. So our conviction is that an holistic approach is necessary for combating intrafamiliar violence and in general gender-based discrimination, as the Istanbul Convention stresses. So we think that an integrated mainstream methodology is thus needed in all universities' activities. This is, as said, our intention to contribute to build up a cross-border European academic network, thanks to the support of the councils of UNIRE. And we are keen, of course, to share our experiences with other universities, but also giving value to the experiences of all universities, research centers, so that just to increase what we have done. So is only just an experience, an experiment, but of course it's very important what also European university have already done in the past. This is my more philosophical thought, because I teach political philosophy, thinking that education and the university system are on the front line for change of unfair conditions, combating domestic violence and avoiding any form of discrimination, if we want to establish fair democratic society in the respect of fundamental rights and human dignity. And we think that there are many challenges nowadays in Europe, but not only. And so we have to, and this is one of the most important issue in education and research. This is our contact, but then of the coordination team, but of course, and then this is our logo, UNIRE, which means to stay together, just to deal with a common issue and a challenge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marina, for the introduction to the network. Now the floor to Professor Michele Nicoletti, who has already been aptly introduced by Marina, so I won't take any more time.
One more, please.
Oh, you have this.
Yeah.
Dov'è non riesco, è questo qui il cursore.
Thank you, Giovanna, and all the staff that has worked for this conference. Welcome to Trento, to our university, for the starting initiative in the framework of the academic network related to the Istanbul Convention. As Professor Calloni said, this is part of a more ambitious project at a European level, launched by the Council of Europe. And the name of this project that I would like to shortly present you is called Council of Europe Academic Networks. It is something like the United Nations Academic Initiative, which was created more or less 10 years ago. And the United Nations Initiative is focused on the so-called Millennium Goals. So we have networks related to poverty or equal opportunities and so on. And we are willing to create this academic network of the Council of Europe related to our convention. As you may know, the Council of Europe is the oldest European institution, now including 47 countries. We include also Russia, Turkey, and Armenia, Azerbaijan, and so on, and has been created after the Second World War in order to protect human rights, democracy, and rule of law. And the Istanbul Convention is one of the most representative convention of the Council of Europe. And we decided to involve universities and scholars and students in this important work of protecting human rights. And so our idea is to create academic networks, not only among institutions and research centers, but also and especially, I would say, among people, individuals, scholars, professors, researchers, and PhD or graduate students. And that's why I'm very happy that some students or PhD students are here in these 2 days of working about the Istanbul Convention, because this is exactly what we would like to do in the framework of this initiative. I hope that during these 2 days of working together, we will have some opportunity to present this project more in depth. But the idea is exactly to give young scholars and young students the opportunity to meet together, to create their own networking activities, sharing research projects, and also sharing good practices in their countries, and creating European public opinion in support of the Istanbul Convention, but what is more important, in favor of a stronger protection for women's rights and human rights. Institutions alone cannot do all the work which is needed. We need an extraordinary effort, and we think that in universities we can find the energies, the resources, the intelligence, the creativity for working together in the same line which has been mentioned by Marina Coloni with this logo UNIRE, which is the idea of exactly networking for a better world. So thank you very much, Giovanna, and all the people who have been working. Thanks to all of you, and I wish you a very fruitful seminar.
Thank you both for explaining so clearly the context in which this conference is going to be inaugurated. I'm Giovanna Covi. I'm responsible for the Trento Research Unit. I'm also a member of this department, which gives me the pleasure to bring you the greetings of our department director, who couldn't be here right now, and of Barbara Poggio, who will join us later, the pro-rector for equality and difference. I am therefore in charge of this conference. Gender violence is also a cultural issue. Not by myself. I could have never done this work by myself. Lisa Marchi is sitting over there, and she's done most of the work organizing and preparing this conference, together with the precious help of Livia Bellardini. And I also want to thank Antonella, our secretary. Thanks to them, we're all here. So the theme of the conference, violence against women, domestic violence, sexual assaults at work. These are things that often leave us speechless, surprised, incredulous. Often, neighbors state that the criminal was a good man. Mostly, we know the media cover sexual violence only after the fact is committed, and they offer descriptions of the crime rather than analysis of its possible causes. They tell stories in which the assassin takes on the role of the protagonist, his life and profession described in details, and the woman is barely named, identified as partner, and left with only the identity of the victim. Rarely do we read about what to do in order to prevent or even understand this violence. Even people who work in organizations and institutions that oppose gender violence tend to talk much more about how to respond to the assault and how to support survivors rather than about how to prevent it. Seldom do we find a full articulation of the changes we need to make in our schools and universities, families and households, businesses and workplaces to prevent harassment, assault, and abuse from happening in the first place. Cultural norms, media narratives, and stereotyped personal experience define cognitive frames that are widespread in our societies and that shape a continuum of behaviors under which hide the signs that might otherwise warn us against gender violence and inhibit it. Until recently, it was customary to silence gender violence under the explanation, "these things happen," and to describe the act with the word raptus, inexplicable mental illness that is set apart from the commonly accepted, thus leaving our conventional behavioral continuum undisturbed, the majority of our society unimplicated, and its silent consensus unnoticed. And of course, the number of feminicides is not decreasing. This is why addressing gender violence from a cultural perspective is both an urgent necessity and a deeply troubling and profoundly transforming operation. Ideological opposition to it should be expected and is already fully in place. Witness, for example, the suspension of educational programs in this province by the newly elected conservative government. Those who speak Italian may want to have a look at the incriminated material that Lisa Marchi and I have produced over 3 years of experience in the schools, and that now can no longer be used. It is here for you to read it and evaluate it, so you can. That the network UNIRE inaugurates its project with a factual reflection upon this cultural issue is a matter of great satisfaction, of encouragement, and of pride. The lectures we're about to enjoy and the papers that will be soon presented will undoubtedly confirm my positive feeling. Tackling culture practically compels us to face what we commonly find hard to confront. Everyday micro-praxis that silence, diminish, and ridicule women and feminine identities, but we consider insignificant. Many people, for example, consider the care for language to be insignificant. Attitudes that assume female difference to be an inferiority. Many people still talk about parenting as mothering and identify the head of the household with the father. The patriarchal system has not nearly been completely uprooted, and its legacy is still fertilizing the soil on which gender violence grows. Ignoring these micro-practices makes feminicide appear so surprising and abnormal when it happens. Blindness to the range of micro-inequalities that persist in our everyday makes us blind to what nourishes the explosion of violence and incapable of preventing it. On the contrary, paying critical attention to these micro-practices entails a cultural change of macroscopic proportions that radically turns our cognitive paradigm. For example, it allows us to see the perpetrator of sexual violence as a common man, and understand that we all need to decontaminate the terrain upon which men may grow into monsters, and women may believe that they love them. Gender violence is neither a problem of women nor a problem of perpetrators. Gender violence is a problem of our whole society, a problem of our still weak and imperfect democracy. Domestic violence is a problem inside our homes. It has to do with how we conceptualize the family. Male violence against women is a problem inside our minds. It has to do with how we conceptualize love. No one is exempt from reconceptualizing the home and love in ways that are no longer hospitable to violence. This cultural work is a form of activism that entails performing acts of civil disobedience, such as teaching women to say no and being proud of it, depicting the women who suffer this violence as heroines and models to admire, rather than as victims to commiserate, considering what it is in our current conception of man and masculinities that makes it possible for a man to turn into a monster. Addressing this problem from a cultural perspective entails nourishing an outrageously mind-changing discourse that may turn pain into power. It is exciting to undertake this task, and a pleasure to open the works of the conference Gender Violence is also a cultural issue, with the plenary lecture by Simona Lanzoni, who is Vice President of Grevio. Dr. Lanzoni, who is going to join us pretty soon, is a political scientist devoted to advocacy activities about human rights, with a particular focus on the progress and advancement of human rights, and a strong commitment and wide experience in the field of gender violence. She's the president of the NGO Pangea, a local vice president. Whoops, she's degraded you. An association, a local for the protection and promotion of women's rights in Italy. She has participated in the drafting and presentation of the CEDAW shadow report and subsequently as a rapporteur in all steps, numerous, that brought to the ratification of the Istanbul Convention. She is second vice president of Grevio, not first. Grevio, for those who do not know it, but I presume everybody here does. Grevio is the group of experts on violence against women and domestic violence elected by, those who wanted the Istanbul Convention. I'm sure that we simply could not inaugurate UNIRE any better rather than by opening this conference with your lecture. So Simona, please join me.
So, first of all, thank you very much to invite me, Professor Calloni, Professor Covi, Mr. Nicoletti, and all the one that contribute to these events. Really, thank you very much. I'm Simona Lanzoni, and I always say that first of all, I'm an activist, and this bring me here. Okay. So I will just go for a short presentation of Istanbul Convention, very short, and after I will read something just to put you some input of reflection. Just a quick history of the commitment of Council of Europe on violence against women. In 2002, there was a recommendation number 5 that was the first recommendation of Council of Europe on protection of women against violence and prevention, and was adopted in April in one of the countries of Council of Europe. As Mr. Nicoletti says, are 47 countries, wider than European Union. And in 2005 was established a task force of experts on violence against women, with the aim to see what's going on in all this country related to this recommendation 2002 number 5. And there was a big campaign in Europe on violence against women, and a very important studies done by the Dr. Carol Hageman-White, that have done a study on all countries of Council of Europe, and so the result was that in effect every country was using different law, different definition, different measure, that there was no harmonization among politics and law related to violence against women. So the task force was saying, okay, so perhaps we need a convention based on human rights that can give a unique frame to work all together on these issues, because data on the other side, the prevalence of data was very clear. So women were very much affected by violence, gender violence. So for this reason, start Gavio, that was an ad hoc committee that started from 2009 up to 2011, January 2011, a work that was done among political representative at Council of Europe, so every political representative of each country, and expert on violence against women, so women that were working on violence from 10, 20, 30 years, okay? And for this reason, in 2011, finally, there was the finalization of the convention and the explanatory report, and the Council of Europe Committee of Ministers, the 7th of April 2011, present in Istanbul the convention. So this is why the name Istanbul Convention. They opened to the ratification the convention. It is fantastic because within 3 years they achieved the number of ratification that was needed to enter into force. Only the convention on trafficking was faster than Istanbul Convention. So in somehow this is also a signal that there was a real need among states to work on violence against women and gender-based violence. And so, finally, there was not anymore a matter of goodwilling of the state. There was a legal obligation for every country with the Istanbul Convention. So actually 33 countries ratify the convention, 13 sign the convention, and just one do not sign, even do not ratify, of course. And you can imagine which country is, because it's in gray, is Russia. Perhaps they don't like Istanbul Convention. Anyway, it's important because as you can see, the majority of countries in the Council of Europe ratify the convention. And as you know, as all of you know, there are 4 pillars that are the most important pillars of the convention. So we have prevention, protection, prosecution, and integrated policy. We are at university, so we are talking more about prevention, and we are talking about Article 14 related to education. So here is the definition of Article 14. Let me read it. Parties shall take, where appropriate, the necessary step to include teaching material on issues such as equality between women and men, non-stereotyped gender rule, mutual respect, non-violent conflict resolution in interpersonal relationship, gender-based violence against women, and the right to personal integrity, adapted to the evolving capacity of learners, informal curricula, and at all level of education. Parties shall take the necessary step to promote the principle referred to in paragraph 1 in informal education facilities, as well as in sport, cultural and leisure facilities, and in the media. So, we monitor different countries. And of course, when we are going to monitor, we are also going to ask, what are you doing related to education at all level? And we first monitoring Austria and Monaco in 2016, Albania and Denmark, Turkey and Montenegro in 2017. And you can find this monitoring report on the website of Council of Europe Grevio. And actually, in very few months, we will also have Portugal and Sweden report, and France and Finland. And next year will arrive Italia, Serbia, and Netherlands. So more or less end of March. It will come also Grevio here, not me, of course, because I'm Italian, but it will come the rapporteur for Italy to hear governmental representative and civil society representative on how Istanbul Convention is implemented here in Italy. What I have to tell you, sincerely, is that Italy is not so different from many other countries. And one of the very good points that Italy has is the very strong civil society. We can really dream a civil society like Italian in other countries, and this is a very good point. I hope that many of you are part of this, and and we have also, not in a systematic way, but in a specific place of Italy, very good practice that do not become system, actually, perhaps in future, but just because the strong civil society interact a lot with institution, or women were part of the institution, and start good practices at a local level. So the real point is how to make these good practices a system, a coordinated system. But okay, this is not up to me. I'm just monitoring. And now I just would like to read one of the things that I was writing just yesterday, thinking to this meeting today. And it's part of my personal experience in Gennaio, but also as personal thinking, just to give you some input of what I saw during this period of 4 years in monitoring, but also in my past life experience. So many professors that are present knows, for example, Professor Calloni, knows how I always supported the importance of academia to promote curricula that include also gender studies on violence against women and gender-based violence education among their students, to prepare them to be able to manage situation of violence in future when they will work. If we will not do it now, we will simply pushing far the time when the majority of the people will be aware and capable to prevent and act to stop violence against women, because this will happen. Perhaps it will take another century, but this will happen. Article 14 of Istanbul Convention gives an opportunity to transform the curricula in a crucial component of any educational process. It addresses questions such as what student of different age should learn and be able to do, why, how, and how well at any stage of their life, till university, and why not, also including PhD. Curriculum approach are important as education that encourage students to question, negotiate and challenge violence and gender discrimination to prevent it. Young people need to be able to recognize what constitutes violence and abuse in their daily life, how to prevent and protect themselves and the others, how to take action to avoid harms to others. Young people also need to be given the opportunity to develop positive notion of gender, including masculinity and femininity and non-binary expression, and to develop increased understanding and acceptance of sexual and gender diversity. One of the potential elements of effectively addressing the phenomenon of violence against women and gender-based violence in any society is the development and utilization of a rich body of knowledge produced by student, researcher, professor, not only purely conceptual, because, this is my wish, they are committed activist practitioner. Many people that are working on violence against women is not working because it's just a work. This is clear. Students of today will be graduated, knowledgeable, involved citizens in their work, in their communities. So if they will study also violence against women and gender-based issues, its cause and consequences, the Istanbul Convention provision and principle and so on, they will act a different society. So now my question is, are universities reflecting cultural norm of power and violence against women instead of shaping new norm? Unfortunately, university is a place where gender discrimination still today translates into gender inequality. Few examples for all. Fewer women rectors than men. Less professor women than men, and so on. Things are changing, but in a very slow manner. This is in itself still a goal to be achieved, to balance the social and economic mechanism by which women are forced into a subordinate position compared with men from centuries, which have led to domination over and discrimination against women by men, and to the prevention of the full advancement of women. So, even university is not a safe place. Another issue that must be addressed is that universities, as colleges, are plagued by gender-based violence. According to different studies, like in UK or in USA, many students report they are victims of sexual assault, intimate partner violence, stalking at alarming rates. It is not only a question of studies and theoretical issue. Violence is a concrete problem for students as for university staff. Universities should improve their effort to prevent and respond to violence against women and gender-based violence, including in their daily activity. Another point of reflection is the limit that monitoring shows during our work regarding curricula and university. This is my personal experience. I'm sure that many professors of you knows states are not in the position to request to university to introduce certain kind of subject, curricula, in any faculties. In most cases, the university are private and they have autonomy in decision making with respect to their program and curriculum in front of the competent minister, like Minister of Science, Minister of Education. Is depending in each country. There are different responsibility. Their autonomy limits the intervention of the state in requesting to insert curriculum and program related to violence against women and gender-based violence in the faculties. This limits the efficacy of the monitoring of Article 14 only at primary and secondary education level. At the same time, gender study was a great achievement to start to focus on women and gender studies, but women are more than half of the world. So why we should be just a sector of specialistic studies and not a transversal matter of teaching and research in any faculties? And now, all of you know that even gender studies program in some countries are under attack. You know about Hungary and many other countries. So, misinterpretation and demonization of gender studies lead to the restriction of freedom and autonomy inside the university, that it somehow go in the opposite of what I was saying before. Ministry can't say something more specialistic on Article 14 related to university because they are autonomy. And so, we arrive to the hot word, gender. Permit me to read partially a recent Council of Europe document that explains in a clear and simple word what's the goal of the convention, to avoid any speculation and misinformation about the fact that there is no hidden agenda related to Istanbul Convention. Istanbul Convention is the result of long negotiation, as I was telling you before, leading to its adoption by consensus by all Council of Europe member states, as I mentioned before. It is based on tried and tested policies and legislation which has produced positive results at all levels of the member state. It is a standard, an international standard made to help women and men to live a better life far from violence and fear. The Convention placed the obligation to prevent and combat violence against women with the wider framework of achieving equality between women and men. The drafter thus referred to the relation between women and men, their role and attribute in society, and thus considered it important to offer a definition of the term gender. The purpose of this term is not to replace the biological definition of sex, nor the term women and men, but to emphasize how much inequalities, stereotype, and consequently violence do not originate from biological differences, but rather from a social construct, namely from attitude and perception of how women and men are and should be in society. Article 3 of Istanbul Convention explain 3.c to be exact, explain thus that for the purpose of the Convention, gender is the socially constructed role, behavior, activities and attributes that a given society consider appropriate for women and men. Research has shown that certain role of stereotype produce unwanted and harmful practices and contribute to making violence against women acceptable. Therefore, Article 12.1, that is a general obligation on prevention, frame the eradication of prejudice, custom, tradition, and other practices which are based on the idea of the inferiority of women or non-stereotyped gender rule as a general obligation to prevent violence. In turn, understanding the influence of such prejudice, customs, and tradition enable government to adopt a gender understanding of violence as required by the Convention. Defining the term gender also help in understanding the definition of gender-based violence against women, which means violence that is direct against a woman because she is a woman or that affect women disproportionately, as defined in Article 3.d. It is not the first time that term gender appear in international legal instrument. However, difficulties around the translation of the term gender and its distinction from the term sex in languages which do not have an exact equivalent have sometimes been used to fuel controversies about the Convention and its implication. Such difficulties cannot become a pretext for rejecting the Convention or an obstacle to its implementation. The Convention does not require an adaptation of the national legal system to incorporate the use of the term gender, but use it to explain the purpose of the measure that it asks states to adopt and implement. The Convention has already been ratified and implemented in countries using languages which do not have an exact equivalent of the term gender, belonging to different linguistic groups such as Germanic, Roman, and Slavic families, without this leading to controversies. So I'm going to finish, don't worry. What does the Istanbul Convention say about gender stereotype and education? So Article 14. Reproducing gender stereotype in education means limiting the development of the natural talents and abilities of girls and boys, their educational and professional choices, as well as their life opportunities. The education children receive influence significantly how they think about themselves, their peers, and how they interact with the other sex. None of what is taught in educational institutions should lead the young generation to believe that gender-based discrimination and violence against women are acceptable. This is why the Istanbul Convention seeks to promote, through the education sector, values of gender equality, mutual respect, and non-violence and interpersonal relationship, non-stereotyped gender rule, the right to personal integrity, and awareness about gender-based violence, and the need to counter it. Teaching children about such values help them become respectful and democratic citizens. It does not affect them in their sexual orientation or gender identity. The drafter of the Convention considered this an important aspect of the prevention of violence against women because attitude, conviction, and behavioral patterns are shaped very early on in life. Teaching the above values in formal and non-formal education setting can teaching the above values in formal and non-formal education setting can greatly help in making violence against women unacceptable. Article 14 offers a maximum of flexibility to states parties because the decision as to when and how to offer such teaching lies within their own discretion. Eliminating gender stereotype does not mean overturning all tradition and customs. Transmitting custom or belief from generation to generation is important in shaping our identity. Some custom and traditional practice are, however, harmful to women and girls and may put them at risk of violence. The aim must therefore to be deconstruct the stereotype affecting women and men that are invoked to justify such harmful tradition. This is about ensuring women and girls are safe within their own families and everywhere, not about asking boys to dress or play like a girl or vice versa. So how does the Istanbul Convention relate to the issues of sexual orientation and gender identity? The Istanbul Convention does not set new standards in relation to gender identity and sexual orientation, including in relation to the legal recognition of same-sex couples. The principle of non-discrimination on grounds of gender identity or sexual orientation build on legal obligations that originate in other legal instruments. First and foremost, the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 14, Prohibition of Discrimination, and the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, like case Orari, in Italy in 2015, or case of 2017 in Austria, Ratzenbock and Seidel, as well as Council of Europe recommendation in 2010, number 5, on measures to combat discrimination on ground of sexual orientation or gender identity. This means that the Istanbul Convention prohibits discrimination on any ground including gender identity and sexual orientation in the Article 4, paragraph 3, because every human being should be prevent and protect from violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much for allowing some time for questions.
Yes.
We have about 20 minutes. To interact with Simona Lanzoni, and please do use this microphone. We need it because we're video
Record.
So be kind.
Okay. I would like to know. Marina della Rocca, University of Bolzano. I would like to know how at the moment are the attempts of specific movements to rethink the Istanbul Convention with the aim of destroying its reference to gender. I know that there are a lot of pro-life movements that are attempting to put under question this aspect and the most important aspect of the Istanbul Convention, and I would like to know from you how is the situation now?
So we are an independent body. So you know that the monitoring consists in two body. One is the political body and the other is the independent body. The political body is the one that have to deal with this kind of attempt against Istanbul Convention. There were many declarations that were asking to change, for example, Article 14 on education, or even to revoke Istanbul Convention. What I saw, because we are the independent body, so we are not the political side, we just monitor. What we saw is that all Council of Europe take a position, and for this reason there was published in November this kind of document about all these misconceptions related to Istanbul Convention, to clarify exactly what is Istanbul Convention, and in somehow to explain that there is nothing to have fear, you know, and society is democratic society still when exists. It's composed by very much different kind of people, and I think that everyone have to understand the importance of the Istanbul Convention, to not have fear to change life or to not destroy family. The one that destroy family is the one that act violence, is not the one that escape from violence. This is one of our major statement that we have done, and it is clear that perhaps someone think that Istanbul Convention is too progressive and want to destroy family, want to change sex to everybody. Is absolutely no. It is not like this. This document that all of you can see on Council of Europe inside in the sector of Istanbul Convention, can read it. Please also spread it all over. It is very clear. We just want Istanbul Convention want that there is not anymore violence against women, and of course, in general, violence against men, women, or human being based on gender.
Maybe we start here and then we move there.
Okay, thank you. Just, I don't know if this could be... Okay, I'm Federica Anastasia from the University of Trieste. I'm a PhD in medical science. Okay, I was thinking about the university and academic training. And from my experience, okay, from elementary school to the high formation training, I think there is a big problem with the books, the article, the paper used to do this type of education. And I'm asking to myself and you if it's possible to introduce some checks, some monitoring, even in the basic book used to really to elementary school and then so on. Because, okay, I saw for research and also personal experience that there is a very patriarchal culture passed in this way, stereotypes, prejudices, and there are a lot of violence against women or gender-based violence in this type, in this way. So I was thinking about really the young children, because I think that prevention, we can say, starts from the beginning, or I would like that can start from the beginning. So I was thinking about this type of check or monitoring.
we are always asking which kind of program they are using, if it's a non-stereotyped program. I think really that we need a little bit more time to change the... I always talk about unconscious, the conscious of the people, from unconscious to conscious. If you see at the mythology, for example, or the history, I come from Rome, and Rome was built on a rape, Ratto delle Sabine, okay? So it was a war rape, but we are just learning this passively and say like, yeah, of course there was the rape of Sabine, that was a population far from, because there was no women in Rome, and so men, they say, okay, let's go to take some women, okay? So this is normal. We learn when we are 6 or 7, like something like this, in without any judgment, okay? And so when we are going to learn ex-Yugoslavia, this is a rape war, okay? And it's very bad and it's terrible. So it's a completely unbalanced historical vision, gender vision. So I think we need time to change also the mythology. Daphne and Apollo. Daphne will be a plant forever, and this plant will be used by Apollo to put on the head of the emperor the alloro, and nobody say that Apollo should stop and should be punished, perhaps, and Daphne should start to be again a normal woman and not a plant of alloro, and nobody say this to children. You know what? Apollo was not so fantastic man. No. He was acting in a wrong way. This is very bad. You have not to do like this, and we have to stop Apollo, and we have to get freedom to give freedom to Daphne. This is the imagination in our very, very ancient unconscious. Why I am saying unconscious? We have to change this kind of imagination. Until we are not changing this, it will be very hard.
I'm Renata Klein from University of Maine. Could you say maybe just a little bit in terms of monitoring, what has been done with regard to monitoring in higher education, if anything, like monitoring of universities in different countries?
We just recall in very few, we are more focused on primary and secondary level of education, just because as I was saying you, many ministers, they say, sorry, we can't say something related to this because it's not up to us. And so we try to recall the fact that they have to be committed also at university level, trying to change curricula, but it's not so strong as can be for primary and secondary level education. This is a limit of Istanbul Convention. But it's not only a limit of Istanbul Convention in the Article 14, it's also the limit of how university and government are structured. So they are independent universities, so you cannot go and say you have to do like this as Minister of Education or Minister of Science. It's a kind of dialogue. And for example, the good practice of Italy is this, they build in a harmonious in a way that all the actors, like Ministry of Education, Department of Equal Opportunity, many universities, and we hope many more, start to collaborate on this subject. But this sometimes happens, sometimes no, and it depends also from countries. Many countries have developed more curricula on violence against women in their faculties, and other less. But this is depend also on the gender equality perspective that every country has inside their own history, we can say.
There's another question here.
Good afternoon. I'm a citizen. I'm not a researcher or anything of the university. And I just wanted to ask about your previous answer about our mindsets. How are our mindset is going to change if a lot of women, unfortunately, are nourishing this kind of mindset that we are okay with this culture of women have to do children, they have to take care of children, of husbands, or of anything. If we don't, we here are almost all women, and how we are to change the world if we think the same, if we think that the culture is okay that way. I see a lot of women thinking like this, and I think this is the most the greatest problem.
Let me tell you something. My mother, my grandmother, my grandmother, and my grandmother will never imagine that I will be here talk about this. Okay, so we have just to see the historical process, and we have to be part of the historical process in an active way. If we see just now, I'm depressed, okay? But if we see the historical process, I'm positive. So it's like this. We have really to see in a long perspective and not in a short perspective, and we don't have to be tired to be part of this process. It's like, non so come dire in inglese, la staffetta. Yeah, we pass the witness one by one, and at the end we will achieve something. Perhaps we will not be here for sure. I will not be here, but I'm working for my daughter, and she will work for perhaps her daughter or her son, for everybody.
May I suggest that perhaps if there is one more pressing question, otherwise I really would like to end on this positive note. Yes, we can contribute to the historical process of moving a little bit forward. Sometimes we do a slide back, but without activism, we do not move in any direction. So let's keep it going. Is there a pressing question, or can we hold them for another moment of debate? Okay, thank you very much for rushing through this very first part of the conference. I won't be this obsessed by time from now on, but there are reasons why I had to be brutal, and I apologize with everybody.
Thanks to you, and I'm
let you
really
go.
sorry
We will miss
because I
you.
will go because conciliation is still a dream, and perhaps my daughter will have the results of our strong work. And I'm so sorry because it's really interesting also the panel and all the intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you for being with us again. Because the panels do take place here as well. Okay, I'm just using the time. As you all know from our program, we have 3 panels The panelists have 15 minutes each in order to allow for half an hour discussion in each panel. Discussion is very important, so please allow us to remind you of when the 15 minutes are almost over. It's a very dirty job that we have assigned to Livia. She didn't choose to do that, but she is the one who will remind all panelists of the time. The first panel that is going to meet here in 5 minutes at 15:30 has Dragana Pejovic. I apologize, I should have asked you before. Mayra Rubach-Topal, more or less. Veronica Saba, that's easier. And Francesca Cimino. So.
Okay, so we can start our first panel. During the first panel, we have 4 presentation, and all of you have 15 minutes for your presentation, and then at the end of all 4 presentations, we will have half an hour for discussion, and then we will make a break, and after that we will have the lecture of Renate Klein. So the first panelist is Dragana Pejovic from University of Novi Sad, Serbia, who is going to present a paper on the importance of gender approach in combating violence against women. So thank you for coming. You have the floor.
Novi Sad on gender studies, the importance of gender approach in combating violence against women. In the last couple of years, violence against women in the Republic of Serbia has escalated. In family partner context, 35 women were murdered in 2015, while that number was 33 and 26 in 2016 and 2017 respectively, and evidence that the number of women that were murdered by their partners in Serbia is disturbingly high is the fact that this problem was highlighted in 2016 annual progress report of the European Commission for Serbia. The European Commission took a position that in order to deal with the problem of violence against women, it would be necessary to implement the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, to improve the protection of women against violence and to establish more effective mechanism for coordinating the sharing and collection of data between relevant governmental bodies. On 1st June 2017, a law on prevention of domestic violence came into force in the Republic of Serbia. The law caused considerable controversy among academics as well as in general public. Further, the Istanbul Convention was implemented in legislation by introducing 4 new offenses in the criminal code: female genital mutilation, stalking, sexual harassment, and forced marriage, which brought about a clash of opinion regarding justification for such offenses. The offenses of stalking and sexual harassment were especially highly debated. The law on prevention of domestic violence. The women's movement made special reference in activities that were organized against the domestic violence to women that were victims of domestic violence, since the number of women that were killed was disproportionately higher than the number of men that were victims of domestic violence. This ratio was used in negative campaign by certain individuals among the experts in the field. The law that was supposed to contribute to the more effective fight against domestic violence, regardless of which family member was the victim, was categorized as the law that sacrificed the family and the altar of women's human rights. Such negative critics were part of an effort to present the law as the whims of the women's movement with the sole purpose of accommodating the wishes of women. In order to prevent domestic violence in timely manner, the law provided for protection orders issued by police officers in the event the officers, after assessing the risk, find that there is an imminent danger of domestic violence. There are two types of protection orders: an order temporarily removing the suspect from the home, and the order whereby the suspect is prohibited against establishing a contact with a victim of violence and whereby the suspect is restrained from approaching the victim. Protection order prevent the onset of violence that too often results in death of a victim, which in most cases is woman. However, some members of academia are of the opinion that protection orders may irretrievably destroy the family. Those experts claim that protection orders have a detrimental effect on the survival of the family. A statement that the orders prohibit any amalgamation of an individual into a higher state of being family, that is, such orders are used to atomize and dismantle the family, is an attempt to annul the importance of protection order that is based on stereotype that family must survive no matter what. Or proposition that the family survive because of mutual obligation between family members, that is on sacrificial giving and not on the rights or selfish taking, and that relationship with family are based on forgiveness, self-restraint, and endurance, is unacceptable in cases of domestic violence. A critic of the law on prevention of domestic violence, that by slowly placing emphasis on the protection of human rights of victims of domestic violence, the law neglects the most important object that was to enjoy, according to the wording of the title of the law, the protection family. Rather, the law inflicts more harm to the family, demonstrates that representatives of traditional school of opinion are neglecting a provision of the family law that prescribes a duty of spouses to respect and support each other. An objection that the law on prevention of domestic violence is an anti-family law that is extremely dangerous for Serbia, and that the crux of this law is not to reduce violence, but rather to diminish the number of couples and marriages, serves the purpose of presenting domestic violence in more relative terms. In the context of domestic violence as a gender-based violence, it seems that certain legal scholars are trying to depict domestic violence as a feature that accompanies family life, hence a woman should get used to it and accept it as part of her everyday life. Stalking as a criminal offense. Over the past several years, a great number of women murdered by their partners or ex-partners in Serbia were stalked before being murdered. The women's movement in Serbia has for years requested for stalking to be introduced as a criminal offense, since it was noticed that stalking most often is a gateway to murdering a woman. However, such request was met with little understanding, and the stalking was listed as an offense only when it became an obligation of Serbia after the ratification on the Istanbul Convention. Some legal scholars dismissed introduction of stalking as a criminal offense as unnecessary, at the same time justifying their position with an argument that endangering personal safety is already a criminal offense, which in their opinion covers the act of stalking. In presenting such argument, they completely overlook the explanatory note to the convention which explains the stalking. To identify stalking with endangering personal safety by legal scholars indicates deep misunderstanding of the offense of stalking, as well as a lack of empathy toward the victim of stalking, which requires or gender-based approach to analyze the office. In real life, before the stalking became a crime, many acts that constitute stalking that were undertaken by person that later committed murder were not most often recognized an action constituting a criminal offense of endangering personal safety. This confirms failure to act of competent government organs upon reports about endangering personal safety by women that were being stalked and that were later murdered. One of examples is the case of late Maja Đorđević from Belgrade. On 12 July 2017, Marko Nikolić, Maja's former partner, strangled their 4-year-old child outside the social service center during the time that was set for him to see the child. Sometimes he brought the dead child's body in his arms and threw it in front of Maja that came to pick up the child. At that time, Marko assaulted Maja with knife. Maja Đorđević died at scene from injuries. Years after the breakup, Marko Nikolić was stalking Maja Đorđević. However, criminal proceedings for domestic violence against him were lasting for too long. A criminal charge against him to endanger personal safety filed on 8 March 2017 did not end up before the court. Numerous calls made to the police station were aimed to calming Maja down without a patrol ever visiting the scene. The case of Maja Đorđević, a woman that was for years persecuted in all the imaginable ways by stalking, leaving messages, sending messages by phone, demonstrates an ability to recognize stalking as a criminal offense of endangering personal safety, as well as a lack of empathy for the victim, even when her life was obviously in danger. Sexual harassment as a criminal offense is also a new offense in the Criminal Code of the Republic of Serbia. The obligation to incriminate sexual harassment stems from the ratification of Istanbul Convention. As with the stalking, this offense was received with mixed opinion from the legal scholars and the public. Women in Serbia are often exposed to behavior that may be characterized as sexual harassment. Such behavior did not receive special attention until the time it was defined as an offense. A woman was supposed to come to terms that such behavior in Serbia is caused by a woman for being a woman, and that it would be advisable for her to turn a blind eye to such behavior. Introduction of the criminal offense of sexual harassment was accompanied with a number of articles full of falsehoods in daily newspapers. One of such articles was published in a Daily Informer on 28 May 2017 in online edition with the title "Lovers, Pay Attention, Indiscreet Flirting Will Give You Jail Time." We reveal what new provisions of criminal code bring for flirting, you pay a fine. After the publication of this text, the Autonomous Women's Center initiated proceedings before the appeal board of the Media Council against Informer for a violation of journalist code of conduct. In the course of the proceeding, the Council established that the article violated the Serbian Journalist Code of Conduct, and the newspaper received a public warning. As already stated, incriminating sexual harassment didn't go without being criticized. Some legal scholars are of the opinion that the acts constituting sexual harassment have been defined too broadly, resulting in incrimination of some relatively harmless behavior, which cause concern that courts will be overwhelmed with these petty cases. Characterizing sexual harassment as a petty offense is irresponsible, having in mind how cheap a woman's life has become in recent years in Serbia. conclusions, the number of assaults on women and the number of those that were murdered, in particular in November and December of 2017, immediately after the law on prevention of domestic violence came into force, demonstrates that fundamental problem lies in stereotypical perception that our society has toward survival of the family above everything else, even when the price of such survival of the family is a women's life. Unfortunately, such position is present even in the legal theory. Poor understanding of criminal offenses that were introduced in the Criminal Code of the Republic of Serbia based on obligation undertaken by implementation of the Istanbul Convention also speaks volumes about the necessity to include the gender-based aspect in analysis of these criminal offenses. Established position present in legal theory call for feminist lawyers to become more visible and vocal when criticizing provisions of the law based on patriarchal structures that are opposite to the interest of women. At the same time, one of the tasks that deserves to be top priority of feminist lawyers is to make women more alert and aware by stressing the utmost importance of the right of every woman to enjoy basic human rights in her family. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this first presentation. It was very useful to have this kind of description of the discussion about the adoption of the Istanbul Convention and of this law, with all the different arguments also against the convention. I was particularly impressed, if I may comment, to read in one of the quotation in your slides the expression that the Istanbul Convention, or this kind of law, was against the creation of a higher state of being.
Yes.
Higher state of being.
Yes.
So the rights of this person is not the higher state. We have another, but you will react at the end of the discussion. Otherwise, we take too long in this part. So thank you. And the second presentation is from Maira Rubak-Topal, Sciences Po Paris, Gender Issues in Feminine Migration. You have the floor. Thank you.
Hello. I'm sorry I don't have a real presentation because I had some troubles, and I'm sorry because I'm a little bit sick, but I hope it will be okay. So I'm doing my master's at Sciences Po Paris, and I'm working on a paper that's about feminine migration, and I'm more specifically studying the French system of asylum. So I'm trying to relate the link between domestic violence and other kind of violence against women and migration. So feminine migration is not something new, but over the last few years this phenomenon increases significantly. It's a common sense that when talking about migration, our minds remind us about men, young workers. However, more women are migrating nowadays on their own, looking for a better situation than the ones they are living in their country. Gender is an important factor when determining who is going to migrate and where to, since men and women do not share the same specificities in their migratory journey. The fact of being a woman puts them in a different position where they are twice as vulnerable as migrants and as women itself. There is different studies that demonstrate that there is a clear link between gender violence and feminine migration, especially one from OCDE that says that women are more susceptible to migrate to a country where she could have more rights and freedom. Where though a majority of women and children trying to escape for any type of gender-based violence do not come to Europe because it's easier to go to a neighboring country. Women represent more or less 30% of asylum seekers in Europe, and according to OFPRA, that is the French Office of Protection of Asylum Seekers and Stateless People in France, in December 2017, there were about 14 of asylum seekers. So asylum is the protection a state can offer to a foreigner who is suffering some persecution in his country of origin, or who is at the risk of being persecuted, whether by the authorities of the country or by non-state agents. The Geneva Convention, known as the Refugee Convention, in his Article 1, defines the term refugee shall apply to any person who, owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside his country and is unable or immune to such fear to avail himself or herself of protection of that country. So this convention does not make gender a recognized group of persecution, but it opens to interpretation. And the Istanbul Convention devotes the chapter 7 to migration and asylum. So in Articles 60 and 61, it's very clear, expressed that parties shall take the necessary measures to ensure that gender-based violence against women be recognized as a form of persecution when talking about asylum claims. It's good to remember that not every woman asking for asylum is basing her claim on a gender-based violence, but because some of them are asking it for the same reasons as men. But it's important to have that possibility, especially because when talking about France ratified the Istanbul Convention and should be aware of the importance of facing violence against women. So in France, you can address OFPRA, that is the office that I mentioned before, and if they don't recognize your asylum rights, you can go to the National Court of Asylum Rights. Although the Istanbul Convention established that states shall recognize gender-based violence as a form of persecution, French authorities often refuse to recognize the transgression of social norms, because according to them, violence against women has a private nature, and since the consequence remains in the family sphere. But we cannot agree with that. And the challenge there is to discuss the concept of gender violence. According to the Geneva Convention that I mentioned before, one way of have your refugee status is being part of a social group, and OFPRA, they have a list of these social groups. And in 2011, it was the first time that France recognized three women victims of human trafficking as refugees. But this decision was contested because there wasn't, at this time, a social group for this kind of victims, so they couldn't be recognized as refugees. So in 2015, we had a reform on the French asylum law, and among other things at that time, they improved their list, and now we have a group that is basically women that suffered domestic violence. But this group is only for domestic violence, and they have another group for sexual violence, women that were suffering sexual violence. So when a woman or a girl is seeking for asylum based on family circumcision or sexual violence, especially rape as a weapon of war, it can be easier to have their asylum refugee status. But that's not enough, because women are living in states where they are victims of all types of gender-based violence, and there is no help available in France. Hence the not in France, sorry, in their countries. So hence the importance of continuing to guarantee the rights of asylums to those women. In a way, they are protected not only from political violence in the strict sense of what asylum seekers know, but because those women come from countries that are not able to protect them, countries that don't have a political, legal, and social structure to accompany them. And violence against women is a political violence in this sense that it cannot be considered a private subject between men and women. In the last opera, they do reports every year, and it's on June or July that the report is available to everyone. So in the last one from 2017, they said that in the last year several exchanges took place with academics that work with this subject to better understand it and learn how to face some questions. We can say that some advances have been made regarding the protection of those women, but still there is many gaps in the protection afforded to women seeking asylum for other gender-related causes. Because, so it's very common in France to hear that the state is trying to protect some women for excision and forced marriage, for example, but when talking about domestic violence, for example, we don't hear the same thing. And when talking with the feminine community of migrants that lives there, especially in Paris, we can understand that actually the French state not really concerned about their needs, and the majority of women are facing problems for being an illegal immigrant, because when they don't give you don't recognize the refugee status, they accord a subsidiary protection, but that's not the same. So those women, they have fewer rights and protections. So a big community of women are there facing this problem that they are without papers, and they are suffering even more violence from the state, and problems that men that are refugees there are not facing. They are just facing those problems because they are women. So even with all the legal text guaranteeing women protections, in practice the guidelines are far from being respected. And because of that, there are women that suffered violence in their countries, and when they are to be protected in some way, they are even more vulnerable to suffer violence again. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
So thank you very much for this second presentation. It was about a dramatic situation of migrants and the specific issue of violence in this most vulnerable situation. And I think that also the third presentation will deal with refugee women, and so there will be some connection. Veronica Saba from the University of Trieste, Italy, is going to present her paper on the value of speaking out as refugee women, intersectional perspectives on violence narratives from a border town in Italy. Thank you. You have the floor.
Good evening, everyone. Glad to be here. The paper I'm presenting here today presents some early results of my PhD fieldwork and enabled me to better understand the architecture of Trieste's refugee reception system and also its charities. I wanted to clarify something before going through the presentation, because my initial purpose was here to base the presentation mainly on women's testimonies I've gathered during this period, but here I wanted to critically reflect on the methodology and the approach I've used during the field, and also I will try to I will try to consider how the approaches adopted by the hospitality services and workers involved in there can emphasize these difficulties of speaking out as refugee women. As I said there, this paper takes an intersectional perspective because the insight of my methodology and my research ethic, it's based on a feminist ethic, which tries to reflect on power dynamics within the fieldwork. However, these methodology are on one hand very inspiring and enriching in the fieldwork, but also I faced many difficulties, and I will try there to outline that using one specific example of an encounter I had with a woman. This woman I want to talk about, it's an Iranian woman, asylum seeker, living in an apart in the hospitality system in Trieste. I met her thanks to her educator because she was asking her if she wanted to participate in my research. She was facing domestic violence from her husband in Iran, and when they migrated to Europe, she decided to leave him when they were together in Norway. And then after that, she was deported to Italy due to the Dublin regulation. She's a very curious woman, so she wanted immediately to be open to my requests of interviewing her from the first encounter. But even if she was very friendly and open to me, I found very complicated to understand the proper way to gather her witness. First of all, there were language problems, of course, because this woman is not really confident in talking about these delicate issues is English, which is not her first language. And we had to think about how to cope with it, and we found a translator, which was a very close friend of her, an Iranian woman living in and studying in Trieste 5 years, so she's very fluent in Italian, and she helped me translating in the interview process. But this process, of course, took time, and luckily the translator was a trustworthy person for her. In the meantime, from the first encounter we had until the interview moment, we met other 4 times, and we spoke about many other topics dealing with our daily life. So she asked me for help learning Italian and looking for a job. And I consider these important things to be reported and to think about a feminist insight in methodology, because it was really important to build a trustworthy relationship with her, and I was trying to build it in an ethical way that counted reciprocity in this process. But of course, it's also very, very tricky and difficult to maintain this reciprocity under control. So that's why, and now I come to the point, today I want to to consider mainly the perspective of professionals working into hospitality system, and not the witnesses I've gathered till now with the encounter with women. In the encounter with workers, I've considered a semi-structured type of interview. The main questions were about their professional experience in the reception of women asylum seekers, and whether or not they faced any critical issue in this kind of professional relationship. What were, in their perspective, the main problems faced by the women, and also if they noticed or ever assisted women who experienced some kind of violence as women. And if their approach was different in these cases from other situations. So here I want to report some excerpt from my first interviews with employees of the restaurant system. This is, for example, the testimony of a worker who works in the SPRAR project, so in apartments. And she met, for example, these two women who suffered violence both in the country of origin and also in the journey through Europe. I asked her what does she do to develop this kind of professional relationship with them. And she replied, I acted as I would ordinarily, helping her with job seeking, looking for a place, being supportive during everyday struggles, trying not to put violence and discomfort she suffered at the first place. What I want to underline here is the fact that this employee is referring to a kind of experimental approach she was using in these two cases, and she realized acting normal and being supportive was the best thing to do after she faced with her first case, because before these two women there was another one in her experience, and she met this woman when she was at the middle of the second stage of hospitality. And during this time, she reports, she was continually reminded that she was a vulnerable person. Everyone was doing so, not me, but other workers did it. So then she began taking advantage of the situation. And she finalized this excerpt saying she decided to be passive since she got an emergency accommodation from the municipality. So here, apart from the fact of the experimental approach that make me think about how things are going on in hosting of these specific cases, also I see some kind of judgment in the testimony of this worker, because she's saying she decided to be passive as she was the women's fault. Also, other part of the problem can be the fact that each case is specific and the approach used cannot fit with every one of them. And the same operator, the same worker reports how the lack of specific education employees can make things even difficult. And here she is referring specifically on the need of education and training on trauma. So dealing with people who faced traumatic experiences. And again, she had to highlight the positive aspects of personality and the life skills of this woman, but it wasn't enough. And then I addressed her also on the approach used with families, So to further consider lack of education in other situations perceived as at risk, because the other cases were about single women. And I asked her if in her opinion, would it be useful to introduce some specific content in the context of hospitality to inform women and families about the available tools to overcome problems connected with violence. And she was saying, I find it's better to wait for the long process that will take maybe years and will be done by the family in a more natural way. So another operator, which is working in an initial reception center, first aid center at the border between Italy and Slovenia, reported me how they often be aware of quarrels between families or inside families, but again, they have no clear approach how to handle these kind of situations. So this makes me think it's a kind of experimental or rather emergential approach somehow. Also, I wanted to add something, some more about structural violence. Here it's a testimony of a doctor who was volunteering at the first aid center of Gradisca near Trieste. And she reported me some interesting insight regarding workers' prejudice toward an African woman who was classified as the bad mother because there were women, and she was assisting them in breastfeeding their babies. And I don't want to read it all because it's very long, but basically it can lead us to more reflection about the structural violence and how the vulnerability it's labeled inside the hospitality system. And the workers were good people, she says. They were thinking they were doing their best, but the plates, its conditions, the militarization, and also the lack of medical assistance in these two cases, it was bad. So to give you some conclusive reflection and remarks, from this first data, I can presume respondents working in hospitality system and management of refugees face many difficulties in finding an approach adaptable and suitable for every woman or family. They report a need for more training on gender violence and trauma. There is also a big lack of other tools able to reinforce and empower women, because there are such other additional activities that can be used as a reinforcement and empowering strategy for helping these women. And also, of course, we face with new laws structural limits that can make what mentioned above more difficult to be realized. As the worker said in the interview, we have to act with the resources we have available. And so all the above points to prejudice, stereotypes, and ethnicizing mechanism can reinforce women's vulnerability and dependence. So the path is still very long, and we all have to work on it. Thank you.
Thanks to Veronica for her presentation. I think that there are many points which deserve a good discussion. Just want to mention a couple of them. The first one was about this methodological difficulties in investigating and translating and discussing with the women who suffered violence. And the second was about the people who work with the women about their preparation, their what you call the limits, and this is a very important point also in our academic network initiative, because we would like also to share good practices in education and training of professionals and workers in this field. So this will thank you. And the final paper is from Francesca Cimino, University of Padua, Italy, on violence against women, why it has become imperative to overcome the emergency frame. Sure. So thank you very much indeed. When you are ready, you can start.
So again, for giving me the possibility to be here and give my contribution. My contribution will be on violence against women, as we already said, why it has become imperative to overcome the emergency frame. The outline of my contribution will be, well, first we will set the context, so I will give some quick male violence against women and the anti-violence systems. And then we will talk a bit about migrant women and gender-based violence, women in between. We, of course, already discussed it, some of the things that I will say. And we will look at examples, so the anti-trafficking and asylum seeker system, the need to join the forces against violence. Then we will see how this dialogue happened, two possible hypotheses. And then we will give a quick look at Article 18 bis, so the right to stay in Italy as a victim of domestic violence. And then I will draw some conclusion referring to the emergency frame and what it can be done. So setting the context, quick hints on male violence against women. First of all, referring on male violence against women in a human rights perspective, we have to acknowledge the progressive improvements made by the human rights women monitoring machinery. So this will help us to frame, give edges to the space that this reflection can happen. And of course, as we already said, even for the contribution before mine, in the human rights perspective, the violence against women was set in the as being considered strictly linked to the gender inequalities and the gender discrimination. I want to base this contribution on the centrality and the importance of the anti-violence centers. Of course, we are all this, but it is important, and of course this importance and centrality was also recognized by a lot of reports, by many reports, such as the UN Rapporteur reports of 2012. And the centrality and importance of the anti-violence centers and the civil society was also essential when the role of the state might not have been able to fill all the gaps in preventing and fighting against violent women. Another important moment where the centrality of the anti-violence centers emerged was concerning the immersion of victims. And here we have to consider both factual and legal data. We have to thank the anti-violence centers for the method that they developed in the years. So concerning composition of women accessing anti-violence centers, according to the latest report of DIRE, this is for the non-Italian, an organization of network against women. Thank you.
So according with this latest report, we know that a third of the women accessing the anti-violence centers are migrants. And this contribution will focus on this. Of course, we already mentioned the intersectionality, the migrant women at the margin. And concerning intersectionality, just quickly, according to the different reports of many international organizations, NGOs, and dedicated projects, the last one is some UNIRE, migrant women who have potentially been trafficked for exploitation are for sure victims of gender-based violence. So here we can see some places and contexts of violence against women. Where do these violences and in which context they are happening? They can happen at the beginning of their journey. It can be the cause, the reason why they leave. During the journey at the borders in Libya, are all aware of the situation in Libya for migrant women, and in Italy. The types of violence could be domestic violence, female genital mutilations, forced marriages, rapes and mass rapes, and exploitation of prostitution. Concerning this last one, exploitation of prostitution, women sexually exploited present at least 3 reasons to be discriminated. They are women, they are migrants, and they are victims of trafficking or destined to be victims of trafficking. So to deal with this multitude of potential discrimination and consequent probable violence, the system that work on these issues might have the necessity to work together. Another concerning the exploitation of prostitution, to base my contribution on these 2 quotations. The first is, it is not migration for sex work that should be abolished, but rather the power relations between trafficked women and traffickers that involves physical, psychological, and economic violence against women, as well as violation of their human rights. And another quotation that I want to read you to link violence against women and the exploitation of prostitution. I translated it in English for the non-Italian speakers. So these women destined to sex market usually already began in the recruitment and transportation phase. The systemic use of sexual, physical, and psychological violence, together with exploitation, are the extreme demonstration of the economic violence perpetrated toward these women. And all this was needed to make them accept the unexpected situation. So we were saying that system working with women where there could be situation and issues related to violence may have to work together. So let's make an example of the anti-trafficking and the asylum seeker system. We had the international organization like UNHCR and IOM noticed an increase of women victims of trafficking among the asylums. And they also noticed the trend to identify potential and presumed victims of trafficking among the asylum applicants. So the Italian anti-trafficking system had the necessity of a discussion with the other system that were in some way dealing and where there could be happen some situation of male gender-based violence situation. Why this might be happen? Two reasons, 2 possible hypotheses. The first one is concerning the entitlement to stay, and the second is the difference of development of the discourses. And now we will go and look deeper into these 2. So the first one is the potential conflict or a complementarity for the entitlement to stay and the related issue. A situation where a presumed woman victims of trafficking who is advised by her trafficker to apply for asylum sheds light on the conflictual situation. There might be a conflict for what concerns the permit of stay, the related rights, the position, the reception systems, and so on. And here I have to open little, I don't know, brackets, talking about the success of the Article 18 of the important Italian law of 1998. This Article 18 was initially created to protect and prevent severe form of exploitation, protecting human victims and enabling a multi-agency work where the different actors were involved. They were not talking of trafficking because the law of trafficking is of 2003, but exploitation of prostitution. And when I say the success of this article, I refer to the large application, to the large use of this article from the Nigerian girls. We could call it the Nigerian women phenomenon. So, starting from 1998, of course, in the years after, we had a very big number of Nigerian women who had this Article 18 permit of stay, and this caused the focus of the work was on this target. So the knowledge of the actors involved, of the workers involved, has now very high standard. But at the same time, this puts some shadow on other kind of violence form against women, such as, for example, female genital. We don't have enough knowledge about this. Talking some data, according to the data collected by the Numero Verde contro la tratta in 2018, the National Commission for Asylum asked the anti-trafficking system to evaluate and eventually identify as victims of traffic 1,000 persons. 91% of them were women and the majority were Nigerian. So we were saying the second reason, hypothesis, might be for this dialogue, might be the differences in the development courses about issues related to the severe form of exploitation and to violence against women. Concerning severe form of exploitation, of course, we have immigration, we have prostitution, we have asylum, refugee discourses, and so the political pressures and discourses more focused on this topic than on violence against women. Because as we were also saying before, violence against women is cultural, is something structural in our culture. Another reason for this could be the difficulties to communicate among the anti-violence systems, organizations, and the actors, at least until a few years ago. So, the law, what happens after the, of course, convention? The law 119 of 2013 introduced the Article 18 bis. That is the right for the foreign women victims of domestic violence to be granted a permit of stay. The law has been studied and defined an emergency approach. Partially devoted to prevention, but more on the emergency. This provision, the Article 18 bis, seem to be inspired by the Article of Social Protection, the one that I was talking to you before about victims of human trafficking, and we have some area of overlapping. For example, Article 18 is for situation of violence and or severe forms of exploitment, and there must be a real danger for the case she, if we are talking of Nigerian women, for example, leaves the criminal organization or the madame. Article 18 bis foreseen dangerous violence or abuse events. There must be also here a real danger in case she wants to leave the situation. See, the two are very, very similar. And now the conclusions. While I was listening to the Professor Covey discussion contribution before, immediately linked it to the emergency frame, the impossibility to give more prevention and more prevention program and action to this discourse. And because, in my opinion, the emergency frame that characterized the discourse on violence, of course, reproduced also in the improvement of the anti-violence system, but it impeded an appropriate reflection on violence, also from a legal point of view. This reflection might consent and legitimate efficient interaction and cooperation with other systems. Of violence against women can happen. And we also have the, again, experience gained by the anti-violence centers that shows how the synergy and the network building among the various public and private organizations working against gender-based violence, this is for women. So I think a multi-agency approach needs to be implemented, and actors involved need to work with other systems in order to capture the complexity and the intersectional reality of violence.
Thank you very much also for this last presentation. I think that also in this case I would like to mention a couple of points addressed me. The first one is the question of human trafficking and violence against women. I find that this is important because in the political discourse all over Europe, everybody from the right is against human trafficking. And so to show how deep is the phenomena of violence against women in this specific phenomenon could be important to say that weaken the system of protection, at least in these cases which are not controversial. And the second the point on this emergency frame, which is typical of, unfortunately, of the Italian approach to rights issues, and in this case is again very, very negative. And would be interesting to see if in other countries we have the same character of emergency, or we have better in this field and not only in this field. Yes. Okay, so thank you very much. I really congratulate. We're very interesting, stimulating, and perfectly in time. We now have 20 minutes for the discussion. Comments, please. We need the microphone for the reason that you already know. Thank you.
Adesso va. Okay. Okay, I have to speak in English, sorry. I am Marina Della Rocca, research assistant at the University of Bolzano, and I'm very happy about this panel because I was an operator in a women's shelter, and I am still a member of the association which runs it, and I did my PhD research, and I am still researching on violence against women and migration, and I work on the relationship between the supportive systems and the migrant women in a critical way. And it was really interesting to see how much commonalities there are in yours. And actually, I would like to say that in my experience, the structural barriers that the migrant women faced in their empowerment processes after violence led them in a limbo that doesn't allow them to elaborate the trauma of the violence. And that is actually the most important fact that we have to be aware about, and actually risk to be, and not only risk, but is reproduced also in the supportive practices. And the current situation of the Italian decree on securities, for example, cancelled the humanitarian reasons permit, increased the structural barriers, the legal barriers that migrant women faced, not only when they are victims of human trafficking, but also for the women that experience domestic violence. And I would like also to add finally that this actually, and I thank you for Francesca Cimino for talking about this emergency pattern in the laws that migrant women, because actually the Article 18 bis don't allow to give continuity to the empowerment process of the women. And also the asylum seekers are at the moment in a situation in which many territories, South Europe is one of them, really don't give importance to the specific difficulties of the women and the territorial committees in Italy, not not enough aware about the gender perspective. And this really now with the problem of the humanitarian reasons permit will make worse the situation of many asylum seekers and migrant women. And that's, I think, and also the role of academia, I think, should be to improve the encounter with the activism in these issues and in facing these problems, because sometimes the time of the academic analysis don't allow to respond really smartly in the problems of the migrant women and or of the women and the social problems that we face. And in this sense, I think that an encounter between academia and activism should be a way to improve in this direction.
Any other comment or questions to our panelists? This is not the case, so maybe...
Well, may I add that
please.
It is in the definition of UNIRE that the Academy should collaborate. So thank you, Marina, for putting that there in the very first line.
I had some questions for my Yes. Just very little questions. Like presentation, I was impressed when you say that members of academia are actually going against the law for preventing violence against women. This shocked me. I mean, yeah.
Yes. we have problem, especially yes, that's true, and especially we have problem with one professor of law, criminal law, from Faculty of Law. Now he is Dean of Faculty of Law, and the most sentences he wrote, yes, is fight against that law, yes. And he wrote many, many papers about that, against the law.
But it's just, sorry, but it's just him, or is there others?
There more.
Okay.
He how to say? He is the first man of that. And the problem is because he is professor of criminal law on Faculty of Law, and now he is dean of the Faculty of Law in Novi Sad.
You? Yes, sir.
Which was raised is the issue of training formation, so the role of the university. But I think that we have to have a new approach also to domestic violence as academics and researchers, because we have to learn also from what in anti-violence centers and so on. So it should be also what we have done, what we have tried to do also with in the last year, so with a center direct called ADV, that means Eliminate Domestic Violence, where we are trying to give space, a free space at the university where they gather. Or we know also the knowledge of police, the knowledge of obstetricians, the knowledge, so that also different knowledges could be compatible, and also languages. And so we academics, we have to learn, which is a different topic regarding the attitude of professors saying, I know, ex cathedra, while we had since 2013 is just to learn, is a reciprocal learning processes, just in terms of training, lifelong learning, and so that the university has a new way just to teach and to share knowledge. So it's say we have not to be professor, but to have a new way just to consider the problem. And is the reason why we in Italy were the first one talking about the MARAC, the Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference, and we were very much criticized because it was very much centered on anti-violence center, because the state didn't have any role, any commitment, and so on. While I think, because I worked a lot in the UK also, in a center of police, because I was trying to introduce in Italy also the risk, not only the risk assessment, because you didn't assess, which is crucial, but also the domestic homicide review. That is what we have to learn from women who were killed, which is a procedure introduced in the UK. So I think that it's a learning also in an intercultural way, because what you stressed is also, social work and so on, they are full of stereotypes. So we have just to learn from other cultures and just to avoid this kind of reductionism to our culture. So it is a continued learning process, first. Second, what is very important also is the risk assessment in an intercultural way. So whether you apply the SARA Plus or the DASH, because I was supporting the DASH, because the DASH as a risk assessment is better for intercultural issues, because I see that the SARA is oriented, while the DASH try to understand also other cultures. So this is very important. And the other thing regarding the feminicide is very important also to learn something from the death of women. That is what was wrong in the protection and prevention. So I think that the university can play a very important role, just putting also in what we are trying to do in our corso di perfezionamento is just to let interact different form of professionals, institutions, and so on. And so it's this is just to be another institution, and is a path where there was also a unidimensional and one-dimensional way of teaching, learning, and listening. So this is really our challenge. Thank you.
else? So would you like to add something or no? Please.
Thank you. I'm Katten, or I finished my master at the University of Linköping. Is it working? And I just wanted to know concerning the study of France, because it sounded a little like France would be structured as a parrot for people who are suffering gender-based violence. If like the new law actually has this, like influences the new narration of gender-based violence in France itself. Do you understand my question?
Kind of. Can you had the impression that from
no, if there's like a new narration in society in France of if there even is gender-based violence in France, or if France is a country without gender-based violence, and that's why you take in people who have faced it, or if if the law actually changes how gender-based violence in France itself.
Okay. Yeah, this one is on. I don't know if I can really answer your question, because yeah, it's not that long that I'm in France, and but there I had this impression that it was the right place to go if you are suffering some kind of gender-based violence. But once you are there, you know that the law and the reality are really different, and from my what I can see inside the university is that the generation that are studying nowadays, they are more concerned about it, but there is this conflict between the reality and the law nowadays. Except now that it started in January, just now, the new Asylum law. I don't know if it's really going to change something about this gender-based violence. We need to wait a little bit more to say, but.
Anybody else? No? So, good. So I think that we can conclude this first panel. So thank you, our panelists. And we now have a coffee break, half an hour. And at 5:30, we will have our keynote speaker, Renata Klein, talking here. Again. So, thank you and see you later.
We're all full of energy after the coffee break for the second part of this first day. I will ask you after this plenary lecture to move upstairs to room 113, because that's a better space for a very short introduction and performance. It's not longer than half an hour, and then we're all ready to enjoy dinner. But here we are with a great pleasure, Professor of Human Development and Family Studies at the University of Maine. We've talked a lot about family this afternoon and the challenge to recast family into another definition. Her gender and violence, and so does her scholarship. I'm not going to read the numerous publications and lots of titles of the courses she teaches, but they very clearly witness this folk-national research experience as a collaborator in networks, and she is the recipient of major grants from large institutions both in the US and in Europe. Her framework, therefore, is clearly international. To learn from her, to launch our UNIRE network and interdisciplinary. She is a psychologist by training, but she's much more than that. And her research is practice-oriented, another issue that we have foregrounded already in the third sector. She can display in her curriculum a particular attention to the local community in Maine on rape and domestic violence. She's the founder and long-time coordinator of the European network and she's a founding member of the UK-based network Universities Against Gender-Based Violence. So again, we have a lot to learn from you, Renate, and there is no better way, again, to inaugurate the UNIRE network rather than with the inspiration that I'm from your lecture, but it's a moment of tiredness, so let me read the title, Addressing Violence Against Women in a Diverse World, 4 Perspectives on Culture. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this introduction and for organizing the conference, for having me here. Particularly thanks to you, but also to Lisa and to Olivia and everybody else who has worked on making this happen. And also thanks to all of you in the audience for attending and for still being here at this time of day. I also learned in the course of the day a little more about the UNIRE project, and it is really interesting and extremely worthwhile. And it is, I want to particularly emphasize 3 points of it. One is the networking idea per se, networking amongst universities, socially relevant issues, and it's sort of oftentimes in academia, as I know it, there's a focus on individual work and on basic research. And to overcome that focus and make deliberate connections between individuals and institutions really refractory for this topic. And so I'll really congratulate you on having this started. Okay, better this way. All right. You missed everything I just said. I'm not going to repeat it. And the third point of it, in particular, maybe this conference and this having it for graduate students, I think it's because it's so desirable and necessary to promote the new generation of researchers, because you have to continue work. And so this is really wonderful. The conference is meant to address the role of culture and violence against women, and so I'm going to share my thoughts on this topic. To begin with, women's activism in white majority contexts often bristle at the idea of culture, because so many times people from the majority use culture to stereotype minorities and to excuse violence against minority women in the name of this. I do think it is necessary to talk about culture in relation to violence against women. I would like to make a few interrelated points. They have to do with the fact that as humans, we are cultural creatures and we need culture to survive. It seems to me as fruitless and potentially damaging as cultural prejudice. I'll first describe very briefly how I think about culture, and then I'll point out 4 different perspectives about culture that I have seen in academic discourses, and also each have advantages and disadvantages, and I think they can complement each other. I think of culture as the totality of human practices, how we do things, how we're organized in families, institutions, at work, in public. That includes norms and customs, politics, hierarchies, religion, all of which influence human activity, and this activity is gendered. What we do and how we understand it or understandings of sex, gender, sexuality, and gender identity. Our activities and our institutions are gendered, and that shapes and reflects our agency. And this gendered activity varies across locations, and there also may be a gestalt element to culture, meaning the whole is more than the sum of its parts. I'm going to quote Barbara Rogoff. She's a US scholar in cross-cultural human development, and she says about culture, are connected. They have a coherence beyond individual elements such as economic resources or family size. What is done in one way in one community may be done another way in another community with the same effect. And communities may serve different ends. An understanding of how cultural practices fit together is essential. Charlotte Bunch said something similar when she referred to the real cultural challenge of violence against women. Violence must be understood as culturally embedded practice in virtually all societies, and not as some marginalized, exotic practice that takes place somewhere else. In discussions of violence against women, mainstream culture of minority or foreign culture is hyper-visible. We often see violence against women as a defining element of another culture, but as an exception in our own. Is that while there is shared common ground among women, we have our differences. We differ in the ways in which we are connected to other people, our family members, in communities, at work, and in public. Violence against women is woven in specific forms. These takes vary over time and across space. Only in the abstract is violence against women the same everywhere. In practice, vulnerability, power, and exploitation take different shapes and experience differently. The very experience of trauma is inflected by cultural background. And similarly, those who abuse and exploit use whatever opportunity a local context may offer, be it misogynistic or legal inequality, or women's exclusion from political decision-making. In contrast, it seems that indigenous societies with little or no violence against women have created cultures in which women's autonomy, it is normal to see women as free agents, free to make their own decisions, and that is acknowledged and supported by society as a whole. It is reflected in woman-friendly norms and worldviews, in broad collective subdetermination. In Western countries, the idea of self-determination is often read as, I can do whatever I want. That certainly is not the case in nonviolent societies, but in truth, I think it is not the case in Western societies either. Humans with each other. The issue is to achieve and maintain a social fabric in which interdependence is based on equality rather than exploitation. Equally important, maintaining a culture of equality and nonviolence is instead it requires hard work continuously. Social and interpersonal tensions are inevitable in human relationships, and they need to be managed in a way that is respectful and supportive of women and men alike. Similarly, an ongoing struggle against ongoing vested interests. The problem of violence against women cannot be solved in the sense of one big effort and then all is well. Instead, nonviolent effort and vigilance. And how this might be done depends on local culture at any given point in time. So why not say it depends on local politics? Well, we could say that, but then we should think local politics, every political and that other people cultural. Then we are back to the culturalization debate and the dangers of stereotyping inherent in it. We could get rid of the notion of culture because it invites so much stereotyping and prejudice, and that is that pretense that cultural differences didn't matter. Debates about women's rights and about the right to intervene in violence against women are entwined with race and class and political sovereignty, cultural forms. We need to understand how a gendered environment works and that means understanding the specific forms in which power and gender operate. We need approaches to violence against women that are culturally included as integral to all gendered practices, and that are critical of culture in the sense that ending violence against women requires a shake-up of culture as usual. Good feminist practice needs to be at once culturally appropriate to support and transform those aspects of culture that are harmful to women. All of us are marked by culture just as we are by gender, race, sexual orientation, and so on. Cultural markers can be intensely personal. They are embodied, for instance, in our accents when we speak, in our body language when we move, and in our taken for granted assumptions when we think. It is not just other people who have strange cultures, we all do. Culture is fundamental to how we are connected to others and how we can connect in the world. Our very agency is to some extent a collective achievement, because how much agency each of us can exercise depends on our social and political and how others respond to us. So long as we stay in our own cultural bubble, we take our culture for granted and it remains invisible. It is revealed in the encounter with others. These encounters can be direct or indirect through news reports, movies, literature, and social networks. The idea of culture is often invoked when something about social life becomes visible that had been invisible. And in this sense, the notion of culture includes the recognition organized in different ways. This kind of recognition can be wonderful and empowering, but we need to be mindful that meeting others takes place in specific historical, cultural encounters offer the potential for learning and insight, but how this works out and whether the other culture is admired or despised, loved or hated, recognized or misunderstood, affirmed or challenged, depends. Cultural encounters may be among equals, but often they are not. Instead, we meet each other in circumstances structured by wealth, race, class, political power, and so on, by hegemonies of different historical origin. Transit, international negotiators, indigenous activists, conference participants, workers at a rape crisis center serving minority women, an undocumented wife appealing to a foreign bureaucracy for protection against a violent husband. Do we meet others? How much agency do we have? Am I near powerless in the encounter, or can I rule it? Must I learn their language, or they mine. These parameters shape and constrain our agency and our impressions of each other. Conditions under which we meet influence how we see each other and how we treat each other. In the academic literature and also in practice discourses, perspective on culture, if culture is addressed at all. There are cultures as different, the other is seen as completely different from us, without any similarities, no nuances. People are sorted into different groups. When culture is different, thinking tends to be ahistorical, unaware of social change over time, and ignorant of local agency. Culture as skill emphasizes cultural competence and cultural sensitivity. This kind of groups stresses the need to bridge these differences. This is to be done by acquiring intercultural skills, language skills, for instance, implementing culturally sensitive policies, and delivering culturally appropriate services. Culture as identity focuses on the embodiment of culture, on sovereignty, on custom and tradition. This perspective emphasizes that culture is integral to human survival. It emphasizes the importance of cultural tradition participating in these practices for a sense of self and belonging. And the fourth perspective is culture as a civic responsibility. For instance, by attempting to end practices that harm women. This perspective is basically inherent in all social justice movements. It reflects a self-reflective critical stance and challenges cultural practices that systematically harm women. These four men must come together. Each perspective, I think, has emerged from specific historical contexts in which cultural encounters took place or are taking place. And these contexts and their legacies, culture's differences, reflect the legacy of colonialism and imperialism. In this perspective, members of a different culture become the other. They may be vilified, infantilized, romanticized, or, as Spivak called it, museumized. Cultural practices are dealt as unproblematic representations of a culture. Gendered practices such as the veil in Islamic societies are often judged without taking context or women's agency into account. Culture as difference recognizes but then simplifies them and exaggerates and overgeneralizes. And we end up with problematic talk, for instance, about culture as deficit, or divisive rhetoric that pits groups against each other, or false assumptions bind services that disadvantage minority women. In this culture as difference perspective, the other, whether victim or perpetrator, becomes an object of suspicion and fantasy, a balance of their own culture, perhaps in need of rescue from the West, should the spotlight of global news shine on them. Cultural encounters become sites of threat or opportunity for exploitation. As a result, the historical and political pursuit and opportunities for cooperation are missed. Culture as skill perspectives are associated with the development of policy in modern nation states. They emphasize, as I mentioned, cultural competence or sensitivity. It is to me the ability to work with people from different cultural backgrounds. Cultural skills may include basic command of another language, awareness of cultural markers such as holidays or foods, and knowledge of how to behave with women and men of different groups. Culture as skill thinking sees cultural differences as barriers to service delivery. The focus then is usually on training and education for service providers. Facts and figures about the culture. It is the ability to engage with others effectively, although what constitutes effective engagement is often left unsaid. That is a particular problem with regard to violence against women. What if conversation with outsiders, that husband also is abusive to his wife? And it is not only about perpetrator and victim, but other people may be in the mix as well and act as gatekeepers or interpreters. And we have heard before the need to have trustworthy translators in these encounters in the negotiation of gender. Culture as skill perspectives do recognize that effort is needed in working with cultural differences, but they sometimes seem to focus too much on etiquette and not enough on many cultures are structured along multiple hierarchies of age, gender, race, class, or caste. The risk of general how-to-behave rules is that they leave gendered power and resistance to intervention untouched. Culture with appeasing with not others, while when we address violence against women, some feathers will be ruffled. Culture as identity perspectives come from efforts to protect one's culture against real or perceived threat for indigenous societies' sovereignty. At issue are self-determination and the right to live according to traditional principles. These issues are particularly urgent when sovereignty and self-determination are indeed threatened, as is the case. But culture as identity perspectives also appear in debates about violence against women in diasporas, such as racial and ethnic minorities within white majority nation states. And minority women activists face multiple challenges, culturally sensitive way. They need to deal with male community leaders who might want to sweep violence against women in their community under the rug. And they need to deal with racism in the police and the institutions of the white state. And some sovereignty when they feel under attack, as can be seen in the current populist discourses. But obviously, the seriousness of threat and the degree to which a culture really is under attack varies vastly. Perhaps one last remark in terms of culture as identity discourses. It obviously also appears in the literature on inculturation. Also sort of adapting to a new culture, learning the ways of a new culture, which can be very challenging for adults, and usually easier for younger people to create new identities and hybrid identities. And people can adapt to new cultures, and they often do. However, the of indigenous cultures by white colonial powers is an example. But interventions in violence against women can struggle with similar problems. It must be possible, and projects like South All Black Sisters in London against abuse and violence about cultural heritage. Finally, culture as civic responsibility discourses are linked with social justice movements. And they emerge or can be seen in critiques of patriarchy, in critiques of rape culture, women in danger, and rapists. Culture as civic responsibility is implied in calls for social change. This perspective emphasizes principles of justice that are valid across cultures. It emerges from women from minority women working in white majority contexts and in the context of transnational feminism. In this perspective, ideas of global gender justice have been articulated that allow coalition building across cultural differences and across cultural contexts. This perspective views cultural encounters in positive light, emphasizes similarity of experience, rejects us versus them thinking, and embraces coalition building. It reflects a willingness so that collective action can be taken amongst temporary or long-term allies. A culture as civic responsibility perspective recognizes that culture is not given, but actively created by people in different positions of power and influence. Sometimes the importance of nuances of local context and the importance of embodiment and the need for transcultural skills, where culture as difference creates artificial binaries, assumes more similarity than there is. Responses to social problems need to grapple with the local conditions that produce and reproduce these problems and the way in which inequalities intersect in different places. Problems need to be, the work of anthropologist Sally Mary, translated into the vernacular, into the local language and idiom. Global organizing supports the exchange of ideas, but these need to be Violence against women is culturally embedded. It occurs in a web of social, personal, and institutional practices, and these connect. Intervention must be seen. Effective intervention is collective action. Coordinated community response, multi-agency work, community networks, or neighborhood projects. They all are collective attempts at changing culture. To paraphrase women, the collective responsibility. The very existence of the Istanbul Convention shows that women and men can work successfully across cultural and national divides, even with a problem as divisive and deeply embedded as violence. Whichever view of culture we take, this view will influence our approach to intervention, and it will make its way into problem definitions and policy solutions. Hopefully, it will be a view that is helpful. After decades of grassroots work and political lobbying, violence against women is on the public agenda. In some places, awareness has increased and victim services have expanded. However, almost everywhere, perpetrators often talk. In addition, we now have, in some places at least, a culture of well-meaning that pays lip service to violence against women but falls short of real social change. Activists challenge patriarchies and toxic masculinities. Over the past 40 years, these movements have gathered experience in how to contest local and national power configurations, and as the Istanbul Convention shows, nothing guarantees the longevity of these gains, let alone their permanency. What is won can be lost. Backlash is common. Reactionary politics have come to the fore. And when violence against women finally does end, we are not done. we will have created new gender cultures of mutual respect, autonomy, and interdependence, and they must be kept alive through hard work every day.
Well, thank you so much for pointing out how humongous the task ahead of us is. But what can I say? At decades of feminist activism, I do like to take up challenges. And I have used this adjective because I have learned from an African-American feminist, Bell Hooks, that feminism is for everybody. And therefore, there's always there that double bind, what we call it. And it is about justice. It's not about women's justice. It is about justice. So you have really pointed the way towards what with this small conference we want to take on. I guess if I may rephrase your first slide in the attempt to establish a dialogue, to move beyond talking about culture, but making culture. Not through cultural politics, mind you, but through cultural practice. Culture. Culture is such a big word. You have defined it in 4 different ways and told us that we cannot settle on any single definition, but we have to put the 4 of them always in contact with one another and with their context in terms of what I can picture myself as being able to do. But it's also exciting because it is about lived lives. And lived lives are never simple. They're only simple within ideologies that want to kill them or want to think. But it's more than talking about culture that we want to invite ourselves and others to do in taking on this task towards social justice. Maybe that's a way to start talking outside without even using the word gender and reaching our goal, if I understand you correctly. But thank you for making things look as complex as they are, because somehow, even though I just said it's all more intimate, you made the understanding of this problem much less academic, and we are here to open up the academy to real life, because it is what we experience, the encounters with others, the sexes and orientations, and all of them are not easily translatable. I do work with literature and languages and translation is a lot of fun, but we have to keep translating. So thank you very much. Sorry I took too much time, but I was enthusiastic about listening to you. Are there questions from the floor, remarks? Would you like to?
I have a brief question. Thank you very much for your presentation. And what is your opinion about the use of the expression harmful traditional practices that to zero? What's your opinion about that?
My opinion about that term, the use of this term. It's probably similar to, I think we're all struggling to find the right way to name what we want to change. And to do that in a way that is understandable to a broad number of people, not just to a very small circle of like that does not finger point groups. Look at that culture over there with their practices. So, on the other hand, or then again, harm for traditional practices, it's also really vague. It does something harmful, nor what the effects are. Well, harm, but very general. So in short, maybe my opinion would be, if this term is useful in promoting the end of it, and when it stops being useful, not use it anymore. I do not have any favorite term to use. Violence against women, gender-based violence, whatever is floating decades of name. And that it is extremely important to name violence against women, gender-based violence, sexual assault, sexual violence, as social problems, to make that visible that way. So in that sense, they're really important. But at the same time, language is slippery. You cannot really grasp something by just giving it the right name. Then it's sort of also always just a label for the real thing. I don't.
I'll let you manage the microphone. Of course.
Thank you so much. I'm Federica Anastasia from the University of Trieste. I'm a psychologist too, and I have in my mind right now, I want to ask you a thing and share a thought about language and the meaning of language. I completely agree with you about the importance of give the proper and correct name to the thing, especially from ourselves, I think, in the beginning. And I think about working for my PhD, and one of the practice is that sometimes, especially when women didn't speak Italian, because usually the husbands don't let them to learn another language, and help a cultural mediator. But almost always these figures is a man, and usually a man from the community of that woman. So I think that it's a big problem, this. And okay, but as a psychologist, so this is the first reflection. Okay, a question is, what do you think about some program for violent men reliability, if we can call like this, because itself, how is it possible, if it is possible, to make a change to a person that doesn't feel to have a problem connected to give the correct name. So I have a request for help, not first involved in the problem, but is decided from somebody else. Okay, thank you.
Yes, just first, I agree with the importance of cultural mediators and whether they're family members or neighbors or whoever they are, that do something and shift the power constellation. With regard to the question of perpetrator program, I do have an opinion about this. And I think that if there is somebody, a man in a perpetrator program who does not want to be there and who does not see a problem, he will not change. I don't think anybody changes anything about themselves if they don't want to. Some men really do have a problem, and that they do want, I don't want to rule that out. But if somebody thinks, this is ridiculous here, and I did nothing wrong, and I'm in my rights, then this person's not going to change through a X number of week program. It just doesn't. It's really a effort that society needs to work out a way to put so much pressure on this individual
that it is in his best interest to change. Otherwise, he won't. And how that, if that can be done, I don't know how that might be done. Put this pressure on is another different question. It's not necessarily the criminal justice system. In some countries, in England and in the United States, the court might say to a man, you must, you know, you have been convicted of domestic violence, you must go to a, whether that's the right pressure change, I don't know. It might be, I might, if I was the man and I didn't want to change, I would say, okay, I'll do 6 weeks, 12 weeks, or whatever, and then maybe employers can put pressure on violence. I don't have a good solution for that. I just want to mention a study that was done in Maine at least 10 years ago, and it was done by the Department of Labor in the state of Maine in the United States, so not the whole country, just that one province. And male employees in the state who were convicted of domestic violence. So these are men, they were convicted of domestic violence, they worked somewhere, they had jobs. And the interviews was with these men on how violent had influenced their ability to work. And it was just stunning how this interferes with men's ability to work, because they were so distracted by constantly thinking about what is she doing right now, or they. So it's really clear that there was a connection between the problem of domestic violence perpetration and the workplace, and what is the employer doing to deal with this employee problem. It's not typically violence. It's not made to address that, but still, it is an issue. A third of these violent men said that their employer had bailed them out of jail. So the men were convicted of domestic violence out of jail, and it's the employer who got them out, because the employee was so important for the small company or whatever. So that you see kind of the kind of social hierarchy of what is how important and how we do this.
Okay. Is there any other question? So 2 issues. One is referring to the role of the employers in relation to workers, I mean female and male. As you know, the issue business and human rights, and Italy was one of the first nations which had a follow-up and also draft a guiding line on imprese diritti umani, that is business documents also with issues of domestic violence, because we are working on my working group, also because abusers or sex offenders, they spend a lot of time when they are working for harassment concentrating. So factories and and so on, industry and so on, pay de facto a tax on domestic violence. And also because women do not work, so they stay at home. And in this case, we have is something that was, so to say, promoted by the Renzi's government, but there is an article in Jobs Act saying that a woman who was victim of domestic violence can stay at home for 3 months, not at the same time. It's paid by the we have this law at least, but it's not so much used, also because you know that in Italy only 49% of women are officially employed, and 51 because women, they work mainly at home, or they have they suffer of that. We are working on human rights and domestic violence and the role of employees. So was the first question. The second question was more related to a question of political theory. Thank you very much. It was very inspiring your presentation. You give 4 different uses this dialectic of powers. It is inclusive and exclusive. And with also an issue of hierarchy, symmetric or asymmetric, because when you talk about culture's difference, you talk about an asymmetric issue, because you mentioned colonialism. When you talk about social rights, of citizenship, because also migrants, so to say legal migrants, have social rights. Then you have another notion of culture and identity, but this is dialectic too, because one side you have like a constriction and the debate by multicultural. Women from Amazonia, they were supporting the rights of indigenous people and the women within their community against the land grab and so on. But then you have the fourth question, and I want just to challenge this notion, because you talk about because Italy is much restricted to the city, that is to a citizenship. While I think that the issues, the struggle again for human rights in general, and in particular for domestic violence, it's a cross-cultural issue, because the movement, the women's movement, patriarchal culture was the same, but I mean, spelled out in different forms, languages, and practices. But I mean, the movement started when the biography of a woman, when a woman discovered that it was general, not within of a city, of a nation, of a state, but was in such a way shareable the experience with other women, and so the movement was intercultural, cross-border since the beginning. So I think that civic is too much more politically, I mean, broader meaning. There is any other question?
I use the civic in civic society in the English.
Civic society, because it's a different. Civic is related to the city. Civil, like in Gramsci,
Yeah.
civile is broader. So civil society.
It's responsibility to creating your own cultural environment, basically, not in terms of to create your own bubble, but that's the yeah. I mean, I have no problems really that given that it is constantly being done, whether it is regressive culture, conservative culture, or whether it's progressive, and that there's a responsibility in sort of taking up the work to change culture and to transform it. That's the only thing I feel society would be fine by me. I'm not thinking of it in terms of restricting it to the civitas. So.
No, it's just because if you say from, I mean, in terms
Yeah.
of political theory,
Yeah.
civic responsibility is quite narrow.
Mm-hmm.
If you talk about civil or philosopher, but I mean, it's the perception.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah. Well, if there's, what is your timeline? And I know it's late and so forth, and so, but I think I would like to ask you, I mean, especially you young people in the audience, to what is maybe your vision right now?
Interesting question. I think that this is a path that, and my experience, It's about to go very deep, first of all inside me, first of all to ask me about what is violence. Am I able to give a name to what is wrong? Where is the border? For taking, first of all, this awareness, this consciousness for me, and then for people that is asking for help, for example, or when I do some research. Because I think that this is the, for example, walk in a city, in a square, and we see, and some people see some other people hit somebody. It's normal and natural, or maybe transcultural, to stop this episode. And I asked myself, why? For example, if we see a couple and he's shouting and he's hitting her, or maybe use too much force on something else, the common reaction of people is, this is not my affair, and they walk around. So first of all, in my pet, and when I say I am a feminist, I can say this with the awareness of the meaning. And so I think that we can share this with all people all around us. First of all, with the example, because when we do some decision, when we take some decision, we do some action, we are an example for the all people all around us. And this is a view, I don't know, a way and the point of view to make real a change, stepping to big change. We can take a lot of panic and fear, and the result is that we do nothing because it's too much. But if we learn to share the big goal, the big aim in small steps, and day by day we do something, this is what I'm trying to do in my life, and I share this with the group, the university group with I'm working too, and with some other people. So this is just, I think. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello everybody, my name is Veronica Maina. I am a PhD student in criminal law. So today I'm finding new topics and new inputs of study. My interest in domestic violence, so I was trying to understand why she cannot get out of this family situation. So during these years, I am and I will always be a student. I want to be a student to listen to other people, to listen in our social lives, in academia, in all the contexts in which we can talk about violence. And then comes the importance of formation, possibly multidisciplinary for law. Today, tomorrow, I think it will be a lot more interesting because I have a lot of things to think about, and I think that tonight I won't sleep. So thank you for. No, no, I won't sleep. I will. No. Projects, new ideas. Me and Federica are trying to establish something new.
Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Okay.
I'm Veronica too, and I wanted to share something starting from my standpoint. I'm from Trieste, also I'm studying at the University. Yes. And so in my path, what I'm doing, apart from researching, it's being involved in this struggle at many movement. And here I want to share some critical, maybe thought about being involved in that, because it's very powerful to be involved. Where are we going? Because the problem with that is we are very far from the higher level of institutions, and it's very difficult to break. And also think about migrant women and also other in an intersectional way, also about other specific conditions, maybe the lower classes. I'm thinking also about how do we reach these people, because sometimes we are in our bubble, as you said, and it's really inspiring when you go to a demonstration with 200,000 people and I think it's we have to be proud to have this now, but it's not enough still. So I'm wondering, how do we find the better strategies also, maybe improve our also to go beyond our own and very specific positionalities. So thank you for everything, for your presentation too.
Okay.
I think that we're kind of running late.
Yes, I think it's working. So I chose to work in an anti-violence centers, and I did it until this is a very difficult and worrying thing, because it's my everyday worry about the future of my daughter. And yeah, I think this is another very important point.
Yeah.
It's talk with the collective voice, because that is exactly what Renate Klein was clearly invoking, and a collective voice that stressed the fact that we need to change also who have to change their mind in order to say no to the monsters that they believe they love, and to the spectators, the silent consensus to what is going on. So thank you again, Renate. That performance I'm inviting you to attend now is also a contribution. It's not meant to be entertainment. It is a talk that is aimed at showing how differently. So what you do now is exit here, turn to your left, go up one flight of stairs, and basically follow me.